Hello again, this is Greg Clinton. In this presentation I'm going to speak with you about qualitative research and historical research. The objectives of this presentation are for you to be able to identify the characteristics of qualitative research, to describe the characteristics of 5 common qualitative research designs, to explain major data collection methods used in qualitative research, to describe how to organize and analyze data in qualitative studies, and finally for you to broadly describe historical research and its major emphases. In general, qualitative research focuses on phenomena that occur in natural settings. So the quintessential scenario of conducting qualitative research would probably be the ethnography, where the researcher is in and among people, observing, interviewing, making notes, doing more observing, maybe some participating, and in general trying to get a complete sense of what is going on among people in this natural setting. And I'll discuss ethnography a bit more later in the presentation. And of course there are other kinds of qualitative research, but in general qualitative research focuses on things that naturally occur. Qualitative research involves studying these phenomena in all their complexity. Thick and rich data is an expression you will commonly hear when people describe the kind of data that qualitative researchers are after. And in order to engage with the data in this way, qualitative researchers view themselves as one of the measuring instruments, indeed the primary instrument that works with the data. And just as a hypothetical example, let's say you're aware of demographic and social changes that are taking place in an urban neighborhood, and you would like to measure or get some sense that you can report to the local municipality about what's going on there because you think it's important. Well, a quantitative researcher might develop possibly a survey and a rating scale, and they would try to measure how frustrated people are, and maybe they would develop a social frustration rating scale, and people would respond on a Likert scale from 1 to 7 about how frustrated they are about this aspect and that aspect of what's going on in the neighborhood. And in that way you would take a complex phenomenon and quantify certain aspects of it to try to derive some meaning. Well, a qualitative researcher would consider that an unsatisfying approach, or at least a limited approach, and instead would want to conduct interviews, do observations, and do that kind of thing in order to get a more rounded and more complete description of what is actually going on. So it wouldn't be along a certain dimension, but it would be a more complex and rich portrayal, or portrait, if you will, of something that's going on among people, using a rich collection of data from various sources that is then synthesized and put together into a narrative or a compelling picture as a whole. To a qualitative researcher, the resulting communication about the phenomenon would have much more meaning than an oversimplified rating scale or some other kind of quantification of things. And fields that typically use qualitative research are anthropology, sociology, history, political science, medicine, psychology, and education. We spent an entire presentation earlier focusing just on the research problem and its importance. In qualitative research, often the research problem is more general in appearance than you might find in a more empirical or quantitative study. The qualitative researcher will sometimes just want to know what is such and such a phenomenon like. And the book gives a couple of examples. What is the nature of the culture of people living in Samoa? Or what is it like to live with someone who has Alzheimer's disease? These are things that are difficult to quantify and that lend themselves better to the qualitative side of research methodology. With such general questions, though, the task of deciding how to go forward with a qualitative study can be very challenging. Qualitative researchers sometimes have difficulty identifying ahead of time the exact methods they will use. The methods in a qualitative study may actually evolve over time. But this doesn't mean that you can go into a qualitative study with little or no planning. In fact, probably the opposite is true, that qualitative research requires more planning, more initial fact-finding and setting up the parameters of the project going in, even than probably a typical quantitative study. So, when should you use qualitative methods? Well, there are several common areas where qualitative research is used. One is the kind of description that we've been talking about already, when perhaps a phenomenon or a social situation is little understood, and an in-depth and close look at that phenomenon is something that would be considered desirable and appropriate. Then there is interpretation. Essentially, interpretation in this sense is when new insights are being sought for something that is already known. Then after that verification, oftentimes there will be situations where a particular approach or a particular way of evaluating or reporting or conducting a procedure needs some verification, needs some check on whether that is valid or not. And so qualitative research can be used to look at that kind of question. And then finally, evaluation itself is an important and very common use of qualitative research. Indeed, in the field of instructional technology, one of the important branches is evaluation research, in which major initiatives for enhancing public education or creating training or that kind of thing need to be evaluated, not only to give some closure to that project, but also to satisfy requirements that may have been given in the original grant for that project, where evaluation was of interest to those who funded it, and therefore they want this evaluation to be conducted before the project is wrapped up. So evaluation research can, of course, use quantitative and qualitative methods, but there is a great deal of evaluation research that does use qualitative methods. And one of the resources I want to point you to before we finish this presentation is a qualitative methods book by a scholar who is quite well known in the specific area of evaluation research. There are several qualitative research designs that are used quite often. 5 of these are the case study, ethnography, which I mentioned before, phenomenological study, grounded theory study, and content analysis, which used to be called document analysis. And in addition to these, in this presentation, I'm also going to speak a little bit about another category called conversation analysis. We'll take a look at each of these now. Case study research looks at a particular individual, program, or event in depth over a defined period of time. Case study research is usually thought of as a single case, but in practice, especially among graduate students, multiple cases are usually looked at. Harry Walcott is a well-known qualitative researcher who argued strongly for the validity and value of doing a single case. But usually a doctoral committee in particular will want something more along the lines of a few cases for comparison purposes. Case studies are suitable for learning more about a little-known or poorly understood situation and for investigating how an individual or program changes over time. In my dissertation research, I included 5 case studies, actually, looking at the individual experience of students in a particular graduate program, which in my case was our Master's Instructional Design and Development program, specifically in the first course of the program or curriculum known as the Studio. And thus I was looking at the experience of these students as it progressed over the course of a single semester. One major drawback with case studies, and particularly with the single case, is the issue of generalizability. How much can you presume that the case you're looking at is a representative case? And so for you as a qualitative researcher doing case studies, it behooves you to first of all present a clear rationale for why the particular cases that you chose were chosen, and what kind of sampling strategy did you use to come up with this or these cases to be studied. And then secondly, of course, you have to be very careful not to make a claim for generalizability that you wouldn't be able to back up. Finally, the methods used in case study research can vary, but they always involve extensive data collection on the individual cases. It is in the case studies section of the book where they first mention triangulation, which is using data from multiple sources in order to corroborate or point together to the same conclusion. And that's really important, especially in case study research where your focus is very narrow on this one or these few cases. So multiple sources of data can help make sure that you're getting a well-rounded picture of the case that you're trying to study. This data can come from observations, interviews, documents, past records, and electronic media. Also, detailed notes about the context surrounding the case are very important. And so, using my dissertation as an example again, I analyzed several sources of data for each of my cases. The primary sources were interviews that I conducted with each student. I also analyzed online design journals that were kept by students over the course of their project. And then in addition to these, there was the multimedia project itself for each student and various instructional materials and artifacts from the curriculum that they were a part of. My dissertation was actually a mixed method study, and so I won't belabor all of the details of that study at the moment, but there was a qualitative case study portion of the research. The book offers a helpful outline of what the typical data analysis process might look like in case study research. But before I go through this list, I want to point out that we begin here on the assumption that the data has already been processed. Processing the data involves having the recorded interviews, the field notes, typing up handwritten notes, and those kind of things, and in particular transcribing those interviews and having a faithful transcript, indeed a word-for-word transcript, available to you for purposes of going through the details of what was said. In a later part of this presentation, I'll speak a little bit more about transcribing interviews, but at the moment we're just assuming that that part has been done and now you're able to start really working with the data in terms of analysis. So the first part of data analysis in a case study would be organizing the details of the case, and this would just be a general kind of macro organizing and sorting. And this sorting might be based on chronological order or based on some other scheme that seems compelling to you. But then, as you begin to go through the data, you would start to put things into categories. Now, it's much easier for me to talk about categorizing your data than it is to actually do it. It can be quite a laborious process. Usually it involves some kind of what we would call coding, where you go through the data and begin to annotate and make notes in the margins. This can be done on paper, of course, or it can be done electronically in data analysis software that we'll talk about later. But the idea is that you spend time with the data, and you don't go through it just once, but you go through, make notes, start to come up with some codes that identify commonalities that occur here and there in your data, and then you go back again and go through another time and another layer, and you begin to become intimate with your data, and it can really take some time. But that is the nature of qualitative research. And once you have gone through this process, you begin to be able to come out with themes or narratives or meaningful categories in your data that can lead to higher levels of meaning and synthesis as you're going through the rest of the analysis process. Then, once you've spent considerable work developing these categories and identifying them, you go back and start working more on the interpretation and looking at the meaning of particular instances of things in your data. Finally, you begin to identify overall patterns and describe what those seem to be, which leads you to the overall synthesis of your data and the generalizations you think you can begin to make. And so writing up the research report is what would come next, and you would begin with giving the rationale for studying this case or these cases. A detailed description of the facts related to the case would come next, then a description of the data you collected, a discussion of the patterns you found, and some kind of connection to the larger scheme of things and the importance of the study that you have done. For an example of case study research, I'll refer you to this chapter by Patricia Hayes in the Foundations for Research book edited by Kathleen Desmarais and Stephen Lappin. This chapter describes a case study of a training program, a summer training program that took place in Arizona, and specifically the experience of 2 teachers in that program. Patricia Hayes uses that case study as a way of talking about case study research. She presents the case itself and then talks about the method that goes along with that kind of research. So that's an example that you might want to look at. Ethnography is an in-depth study of a group that shares a common culture. The focus of ethnography research is on everyday behaviors of the people in the group with an intent to identify cultural norms and beliefs and social structures and other cultural patterns. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a desire in ethnography to paint a more holistic picture of what is being studied. So ethnography is useful for gaining an understanding of the complexities of a particular culture. Now, ethnography grew out of cultural anthropology, and you can imagine that in an earlier time, ethnography was more closely associated with American or European researchers going to foreign lands and spending time with a particular ethnic group to get to know what their culture is like as a whole. Ethnography has since grown and evolved and adapted to a number of other applications, but the common thread is still that there is a common culture in the group being studied, whether it's in a more transient or temporary kind of community, or whether it's a subgroup within a larger culture, or what have you. There are a lot of adaptations that have been done with ethnography. And so the method in ethnographic research is site-based fieldwork, of course, gaining access to a site, usually with some kind of key person who serves in a gatekeeper role for the researcher. This is someone who can vouch for the researcher to the other members of the community, of course. And then establishing a rapport with the people being studied, definitely informed consent is a part of that. Participant observation, extensive field notes, and interviewing. And the role of the researcher is that of a careful observer, interviewer, and listener. As is common in qualitative research, data collection and data analysis tend to overlap in ethnography. In any case, the data analysis process may be looked at in 3 parts, one being the description, where you're describing events in a chronological order. You're describing a day in the life, so to speak, of a group or of an individual, focusing on perhaps a critical event for the group, and developing a storyline, a narrative, complete with plot and characters. Then comes analysis, identifying the categories and patterns that have emerged from the description, and then finally some kind of broader interpretation looking at the general nature of that culture. Now, the research report in ethnography is often takes the form of a published book. A full-blown ethnography can be quite large, but the report in general would involve an introduction that provides a rationale and context for the study, a description of the setting and methods, an analysis of the culture studied, and some kind of conclusion. I have two ethnography examples to share, and the first one is John L. Jackson's study called Harlem World. John Jackson spent about 6 years living among the people of Harlem, interviewing, observing, and doing the things that an ethnographer does, and this book is quite an interesting read. The language that the book is written in has, for my own personal taste, has a bit too much flowery academic language in it, so it makes it a little bit thick reading-wise, but if you can get past that, it's a very, very interesting portrait of life in Harlem in the 1990s. The next example I want to mention of an ethnography is a smaller scale instance taking the form of the dissertation recently completed by Doug Holshoe here in our instructional technology program. This is what might sometimes be called a microethnography because the community being studied was one of the instructional design and development teams in the studio program, and of course the length is the length of one semester. And I hesitate to call that a smaller scale study because this was an enormous dissertation. However, in comparison to a 6-year study like that of John L. Jackson or something like that, it certainly is smaller. But Doug's study provides a great example of applying a qualitative research method like ethnography to instructional technology research specifically. Next on our list is phenomenology, and phenomenological study refers to a person's perception of the meaning of an event as opposed to the event as it exists external to the person. So in other words, we're trying to get that very up close and personal interpretation of how something is experienced through the eyes of an individual or a group of individuals. So we're seeking to understand people's perception, perspectives, and understandings of a particular situation. In other words, what is it like to experience such and such a thing? The book offers several examples. Say, a researcher might study the experiences of people caring for a dying relative. Or you could ask, what is it like to live in an abusive relationship, or to homeschool a child? Another phenomenological question that could be asked and answered with research is, what is it like to be a graduate student in an online course in the College of Education of the University of Georgia? As far as method is concerned, phenomenology relies heavily on lengthy interviews with a carefully selected sample of participants. When the research question has been identified, then of course one wants to go and find those people who can actually speak from that first-hand experience and who would be the best informants to get at the heart of the matter, which is the description of this experience firsthand. Given the length of these interviews, you would want to not have too many of them if possible, because it will involve a great deal of transcribing and analyzing interview data. So the sample size will be somewhere from maybe 5 to 25 people. These interviews are often very unstructured, and if you were to be a fly on the wall observing one of these, even though it would be a carefully conducted research interview, it would appear just like a pretty normal conversation with the researcher doing most of the listening. One thing that's really important in phenomenology is that you as a researcher have to identify your personal views of things and make an effort to bracket these or set these aside so that you can put on a set of fresh ears and be as perceptive and as open as possible to what your participants are saying. Data analysis for phenomenology is guided by the almost purely descriptive intent of the research. So you would identify statements that relate to the topic, group statements into meaningful units of some kind, seek divergent perspectives, and then construct a composite picture, an overall picture of the phenomenon that you are trying to study. For the research report in phenomenology, there is no specific structure that's prescribed, but as in any qualitative research report, you would want to present the research problem or the research questions, describe your method of data collection and analysis, draw a conclusion about the phenomenon you've studied, relate your findings to some existing body of theory and research, and finally discuss any practical implications of your findings. Here is an example of phenomenological research. This is a study that was conducted by Edward Casey in the 1970s and with a follow-up in the 1990s, and it's called Imagining, a Phenomenological Study. This report goes into a description of phenomenology and then detailed descriptions of individuals describing their experiences while actively engaging their imagination. And this is a topic that I think most anyone would find fascinating. It was of especial interest to me as someone who has studied creativity and the creativity literature along with my study of instructional technology. We now come to grounded theory. You know, we normally think of theory as something that is intended to be broadly applicable and that is built on the scholarship that has gone before, plus probably some research and also the imaginative reflection of a scholar. And so we have a lot of theories that we've learned about in our graduate education. So when I first heard about grounded theory, I was a little puzzled, thinking of theory in the way that I was used to thinking of theory, and it being something new to me to think of theory as emerging from a particular set of data in one specific research project. But that is the idea behind grounded theory. The idea is that the researcher may not even do a literature review, but may have decided to approach a particular phenomenon with the freshest eyes possible, similar to what we talked about with phenomenology. But in this case, there is an intentional setting aside of any theoretical framework whatsoever and an attempt to go through the data and to let the data speak for itself so that any theory about the phenomenon does emerge out of the data. And of course, this depends on a very conscientious effort on the part of the researcher to keep other influences from biasing the interpretation of the data as much as possible. So once again, we begin with the data, and any theory that emerges should be clearly grounded in real data that has been empirically collected. So grounded theory is something that tends to be helpful when current theories about a phenomenon are either inadequate or non-existent. And it typically focuses on a process of some kind related to a particular topic with the ultimate goal of developing a theory about that process. And the book gives several examples of topic areas where grounded theory has been used, including management of a difficult pregnancy, ways in which scientists work, remarriage following divorce, etc. So what is this data that we're going to use to build some new theory out of? Well, first of all, the data is collected in the field. It is done with a flexible approach, and the methods or kinds of data being collected are likely to change and evolve over the course of the study. Interviews do play a major role, but observations, documents, historical records, and videotapes are typically also included. The data collection must include the perspectives and voices of the people being studied. And in this case, data analysis begins almost immediately. So there is an engagement with the data right from the start, because that is where any theoretical framework will be found, will be in the emerging data. With most qualitative methodologies, it is the approach to data analysis that sets a particular method apart, and that is certainly true of grounded theory. Most qualitative data analysis involves coding of some kind. But it is with grounded theory that open coding and axial coding are most closely associated. Open coding is just the process of going through each line or sentence or paragraph of your data and asking yourself the question, what is this about? What is this referring to? And then making marginal notes, creating codes to correspond to those things. Once you've done several layers of this with your data, then in grounded theory, an emphasis is placed on axial coding, in which one goes back and starts to make connections between existing codes, looking for threads where there may be an antecedent and a consequence that can be found, or a particular action being taken, and a particular context in which these things occur. So that's axial coding, and I like to think of that as coding along certain axes. That sort of helps me remember the meaning of axial coding. And then there's selective coding, which is specifically looking for a narrative, looking for a compelling story that seems to be perhaps the common thread in the phenomenon that you're studying. And once you have done these kinds of analysis, there finally comes the development of some kind of theory or model to try to explain the phenomenon that you are studying. And the research report in grounded theory is done in a more objective style. And you might be surprised to hear that, because grounded theory is in some ways a little more radically set apart from other kinds of research, with this idea that you may go in to study something without doing a literature review and just try to collect the data and let all of the research fruit come out of the data. But grounded theory is actually more connected to an objective approach and a belief in the researcher as someone who is striving for objectivity, more so than some of the other qualitative methodologies. Beyond the generally objective approach to the style of the report, the other sections are very similar to what we've talked about. Description of the research question, literature review, description of methodology and data analysis, presentation of your theory, which is a little bit more than maybe the discussion and conclusions you might do in another kind of study, and then finally a discussion of implications. The general framework of grounded theory has been applied across a wide range of qualitative applications. So it would be common, for example, to find a case study project in which the basic approach to data analysis was presented as a grounded theory approach. However, here is an example, indeed a collection of examples, of what might be thought of as more quintessential grounded theory research. This is a study by Kathy Sharmaz, Identity Dilemmas of Chronically Ill Men, and it was included in this collection edited by Strauss and Corbin, who are highly respected names in qualitative research and especially in grounded theory. The study by Dr. Sharmaz presents a poignant picture of the mental processes and social adjustments that men who have chronic illness go through. And with its focus on identity issues, I believe this study would be an example of a researcher going into relatively unknown territory and illuminating a phenomenon. I don't intend to focus a great deal on content analysis, but this is one other category that the book includes in the qualitative methodologies. And as you can imagine, there's a close affinity between content analysis and historical research, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this presentation. Content analysis is basically what used to be called document analysis, and it does involve a great deal of planning if you are doing a study that just uses this method. It is a detailed and systematic examination of the contents of a particular body of material for identifying patterns, themes, or biases. And one particular thing that the book does point out is that content analysis is often used in the context of other studies, so it's not necessarily a standalone methodology, except in certain cases. Note that content analysis can use both quantitative as well as qualitative data, and it depends on your approach whether certain statistical procedures will be useful for you in working with that data. Usually these would involve simple things like frequencies or percentages. And finally, a research report for a content analysis study would follow a similar format overall to the ones that we've already looked at. One last methodology that I'd like to mention that is not covered in the book chapter is conversation analysis. This is an approach to working with data in a very fine resolution, and once again it may be referred to as a methodology, but it's really a specific approach to data analysis, not necessarily tied to a specific category of qualitative research. It typically examines short passages of data in great detail. It looks at social interactions at this very fine resolution and brings to light things such as turn-taking, status signals that are given and received by persons in the conversation, uses of power, social distance, and other social signals that may be present just in the exchange of conversational routine between one person and another. Dr. Kathy Rulston here at the University of Georgia is an expert in this technique, and if you have an interest in this area, I'm sure she would like to tell you more about it. Conversation analysis is related to a wider category that includes discourse analysis, ethnomethodology, and what's called membership categorization analysis. And I won't try to elucidate all of those, but there is generally this look at what happens in the social exchanges between people. There are some general things to keep in mind regarding data collection and qualitative research. First of all, use multiple forms of data in any single study. This is a desirable part of the credibility of your study as you use triangulation to corroborate your findings from more than one source. Also, in qualitative research, the design of the study can emerge and evolve, as we've talked about some already. Data collected early in the investigation can actually influence the kinds of data that you may decide to go after as the research progresses. Also, the potential sources of data are limited only by your open-mindedness and creativity. Qualitative research admits all different kinds of data. But bear in mind, data collection does take a great deal of time. This is not to be underestimated. Finally, it is essential that data collection methods are done consistently with ethical principles. In other words, you must obtain informed consent from your participants, and when you do your write-up, and even when you work with your data, you should adopt pseudonyms so that the real identity of your participants is not known. And of course, here at the University of Georgia, any research project that you propose has to go through our institutional review board, and they are in charge of protecting the interests of human subjects. So you have a fairly rigorous form and set of documentation that you have to submit about your study to get it approved. Your sample is the particular set of people that you decide to collect data from. Sampling can be used to refer to things other than people, but normally when we talk about the sample for a piece of educational research, we are talking about people. The people you choose to interview or to observe, etc., are usually a subset of some larger group that you're trying to learn about. In quantitative research, there is an ideal that we sometimes are able to reach for, which we call random sampling. But in qualitative research, random sampling is not usually of interest or even possible. So rather, as we talked about a little earlier in the presentation, the normal approach to that issue is to look for people who can be key informants for the particular issues that you're trying to study. That is called purposive sampling or purposeful sampling, and it is perfectly acceptable in most contexts in qualitative research. Perhaps the two most common sources of data in qualitative research are observations and interviews. Observations are usually conducted either in the role of a relative outsider or as a participant observer, which is the common model used in ethnographies. Normally, observation is intentionally unstructured. One wants to take advantage of unforeseen data sources. One wants to be open to unforeseen events or unforeseen perceptions of what is being observed. There are some drawbacks to unstructured observation. You may not know what things are most important to look for when you get started. Also, the researcher may alter what people say and do, and may alter how significant events happen just by being present in the setting. Some suggestions for you when you do conduct your observation sessions. Before beginning, identify the particular methods that seem to work best for you and practice them in other contexts before you go and do the real thing. If possible, have someone introduce you to the people you are watching. It certainly can give you an enormous boost in comfort level if you know that your presence is known and accepted. It'll help you to remain relatively quiet and inconspicuous, and yet be friendly to anyone who approaches you. In other words, you should not go out of your way to look for distraction that would take you off task from your observation. But of course, you don't want to be off-putting to people if they choose to interact with you. When taking field notes, one method that has distinct advantages is to divide your notebook into two columns, a left column to actually make your observation notes, and the right column to write preliminary interpretations that come to mind. And finally, it's essential not to confuse your actual observation data with your interpretation of that data. These two are easily confused until you get the hang of this, so the two-column approach can really help you if you're a beginner. I would also add a comment that when you're observing, if you stare at people, they will become uncomfortable, even if you have their permission to observe. So it is a bit of an art, and it takes practice to do careful observation and yet to keep from staring or acting oddly, or otherwise drawing attention to yourself. Interviews can involve a wide range of questions, including questions about facts, about people's beliefs and perspectives about the facts, questions about feelings or motives, present and past behaviors, standards for behaviors, and conscious reasons for actions or feelings. And I'm sure there are other categories of questions as well. Do note that the human memory is not perfect. In fact, there have been studies in recent times that have had enormous implications for courtroom procedures because the reliability of eyewitnesses, especially after longer periods of time, has been shown to be not so reliable. So your interviewee may recall what might have happened or what they think should have happened instead of what really happened. You'll just need to be aware of this and to work with and interpret your data as wisely as possible. Interviews are mostly either open-ended or semi-structured, and there is such a thing as an interview for quantitative research, and that's kind of a different animal that'll be covered at a different point in this course. But qualitative interviews typically will involve certain targeted questions and possible probes after those questions. But when the key questions are asked to your participant, the idea is to leave that door open to probe and to look for other ways to clarify and to help that person express themselves and to get at what it is you're trying to learn from them. Finally, if you should have a need to work with focus groups, this is an interview with several participants simultaneously. You don't want that to be too many. I would think 5 or 6 would be plenty rather than the 10 to 12 that's mentioned in the book. And take note that focus groups can be challenging to get together, particularly if the topic area you're working with has any kind of sensitivity to it. And I speak from personal experience there. The book gives an excellent set of general guidelines about conducting interviews successfully. First, identify some questions in advance, and these should arise out of your research proposal and your research questions. Make sure your interviewees are representative of whatever group you're trying to learn about. Find a suitable location. This can be challenging, but generally you want to find something quiet enough that will allow you to conduct the interview without distraction. Get written permission. If you go through the IRB process here at UGA and get your study approved, then a part of that process will be a consent form that they will sign off on as an appropriate informed consent form. So you'll bring that with you to the interview. Actually bring 2 copies, one for the interviewee to keep and one for you to keep, with signatures. Establish and maintain rapport with the interviewee. This can take a little bit of warm-up, but that rapport can go a long way in helping you accomplish what you are trying to accomplish. And also focus on the actual rather than on the abstract or on the hypothetical. Don't ask your interviewee to speculate. When you're interviewing, don't put words in the other person's mouth. And this is easy to say, but it's actually quite hard to do. It takes practice just to get out of the way and let your interviewee respond. Record interviewee responses verbatim. In the old days, this was done with pen and paper and was quite challenging. Then tape recorders came along, and that facilitated interview research quite a bit. But these days, digital recording devices have really come into their own, and there are lots of options that you have to do this. I myself have settled on using the software GarageBand because I carry a Macintosh laptop around with me, and that software works very easily and intuitively. In the PC realm, the software Audacity, actually Audacity is for the PC or the Mac, and it's also not only quite easy to use, but it's open source freeware, so I highly recommend taking a look at that software. But in the meantime, looking at devices as a whole, many of the MP3 players that are on the market today have recording capability and can record up to 2 hours or so of length. So that's something that may be open to you, and that material can be then imported into your computer for editing. Also, there are attachments available for iPods, such as the iTalk unit, and that converts your iPod into a recording device that can be used in a similar way. I've already mentioned GarageBand and Audacity, but you should be aware also that if you are a student here in the College of Education, there are specialized digital recording and transcribing devices that are available for checkout in our OIT office. So you'll want to be aware of that, and if you don't have another option that is handy for you, you can check with OIT and find out how many days at a time you can check out these materials to use for your convenience. Next, keep your reactions to yourself. This is also quite difficult, maybe the most difficult thing about doing interviews for research. The reason for this, in my thinking, is that in your normal, everyday conversational skills, you put a lot of energy in responding with agreement or with empathy or even with disagreement as the occasion allows, and that is a normal part of everyday conversation, but it is an intrusion into a data collecting process with an interviewee. So that is something definitely to practice. And the simplest way to think of this is to try to limit your responses to variations of thank you, your responses are very helpful, and good. Do remember that when you get responses from someone, you are not necessarily getting the facts, but you are getting their take on the things that you're asking them about, and normally that is what you're after. On this slide, I have some words of advice for you about working with your interview transcriptions. First of all, I want to say the transcript should be done carefully, word for word. Small mistakes can lead later to misinterpretation, so do this very carefully. Also, don't get too hung up on the minute details of pause length and other annotations in your transcripts. I have seen some very elaborate schemes for doing transcripts, and essentially what they were to me was an attempt to represent as fully as possible on paper the nuances of the inflections and the pause lengths and the other subtleties of the sound recording. And to me, perhaps coming from my perspective as a musician, I see the goal of trying to capture the sound recording on paper as being an impossible goal. So the end result of that effort was a transcript that was largely unreadable to me. It had so much clutter in it that it ceased to be useful in terms of looking at the natural language of what the person said. So not everyone will necessarily agree with me about this, but my solution is to stay close to the audio recordings. In fact, to return to them from time to time during the analysis and interpretation process of a particular research project. In that way, you get to be reminded of the subtleties that you're looking for in what your interviewee had to say without the burden of trying to represent all of those subtleties on paper in the transcript itself. Now that doesn't mean that I recommend having no annotations, no pauses indicated or anything like that. That is not my intent. But what you won't find me doing is indicating that one pause length is 3.23 seconds and another pause length is 2.79 seconds and so on. I don't think that that level of clutter in the transcript is necessary. I do indicate longer pauses in my transcripts, and I also use commas very ungrammatically to indicate any of the very common pauses that happen in normal spoken language. So commas become a natural way to represent the flow of thought, phrase by phrase, in a form that remains very readable. And once again, I don't expect you to adopt the specific adaptation that I use in creating transcripts, but I offer these thoughts as some general tips for you. Another tip for you is not to overload yourself with too many interviews, if possible. It's very, very easy to underestimate the hours and hours that one will spend. If you do transcribe them yourself, then that itself is very time consuming, and then there is the analysis process of working with that data. So I would recommend determining how many interviews would be sufficient to address your research questions, and try not to let that grow out of hand just as a practical matter. Do some of the transcribing yourself, if at all possible. This is a way to become intimate with your data that can hardly be replaced by anything else. However, at the same time, for the practical reasons just mentioned, I would hire out the remaining portion of the interviews if you can afford it, and then when you get those back from the transcriber, do a complete through check of their work, making corrections as you go. Obviously, you were present when the interview was conducted, so you will have insights into what the person said that the transcriber may have had trouble with. So you'll be able to actually make corrections and to make the transcription better by going back through the transcriber's work. And this becomes a part of your mental processing of the data, and that becomes a substitute for doing the transcription yourself. Not an equal substitute, I don't think, but I think that that is a compromise that makes sense, to do some of the transcripts yourself if possible, and then to hire out the rest if you can afford to do so, and if your research involves several interviews. The book provides a graphic depiction of a spiral approach to organizing and analyzing your data based on the work of Creswell. And I really like this representation because I think it represents well the iterative process that one needs to go through in returning back to your data again, layer after layer, and moving forward with the overall sense of progress in the project, but with a lot of doubling back. So it is not strictly a linear process by any means, and I would say there are probably many, many more loops that could be represented in the diagram, but the more you keep going with that next layer with your data, the closer you get to that synthesis that you're looking for in your research project. I have added a slide here because I thought it would be good to talk for a moment about presenting your data in the form of a research report. We've been talking about writing up your research report in previous sections of this presentation, but now I just want to call your attention to a recent trend in qualitative research, and that is a creative alternative to the traditional research report. There has been some experimentation among certain qualitative researchers with alternative ways of writing up and presenting the data from their research projects, and these might take the form of drama or poetry or a dance depiction of what the data represented, perhaps fictional prose, perhaps painting. But I want to first highlight again the norm, which is a formal written report, or in the case of ethnography, possibly a longer narrative in book form. But what I'm speaking of is nonfiction prose. And there is certainly some variation within the realm of a formal research report. But these have been efforts to reach a wider audience with research, and an effort to be creative and to try to do something different. Well, I would like to give you my take on this, and of course this is the world according to Greg. But I think that this is something important to think about, because if you continue with an interest in qualitative research, then this issue is bound to come up. And first of all, as a creative person myself, I am all for creativity just about wherever I can find it. So, vive la créativité! But I want to point out that practicing artists and poets and creative writers all have credentials in their respective fields, and those credentials come from the judgment of their peers about their creative work. Researchers don't have this. We have credentials as researchers, but we don't have credentials necessarily as painters or novelists or poets. So that means that if I am an educational researcher and I decide to represent some of my data in poetry, and I'm an awful poet, then there's no one with the creative authority among my researcher peers to tell me that my poetry is bad. So once again, in the world according to Greg, I would say, don't foist your bad poetry or your bad painting on those who need to access the results of your research. Provide them with a formal report as a first option. Then, if you can, by all means go beyond that with creative ways to present your data, and in particular, if you have opportunities to present your research at conferences, then it is a well-known thing that often research presentations at conferences are very dull. So if you have a way to look at that creatively, to think outside of the box in how you can reach a wider audience with your research, I am all for that, and I don't see how anyone could argue with that. But if you want to reach the widest possible audience of scholars with your research results, then provide them with a formal research report as a first option. Once again, I don't expect everyone to necessarily agree with me, and indeed I don't have the credentials and the long history of experience with qualitative research that many others have, and so they could certainly speak to this issue with more weight than probably I can. All the same, I hope I'm encouraging you to think critically about the possibilities as you go forward as a researcher. There are an increasing number of software programs out there that can help you with your qualitative research. They include programs such as Ethnograph, HyperQual, HyperResearch, Qualitan, N6, which was formerly called Nudist, InVivo, WinMax, and Qualrus. And I did not use any of these in other projects that I was involved in, but for my dissertation I used InVivo, and at that time version 7 had just come out, which was a nice usability improvement. So I was pretty pleased with my experience with InVivo. However, it cost me as a student $200 for a one-year license for the software, and it costs a good bit more than that for a non-student to have a regular license to the software. And others of these are priced differently. I think some of them may even be freeware. I'm not sure about that. But these are names that you can check on. And Hyper Research is a program that is for the Macintosh, if you're a Macintosh user. I gave that program a try once, but was not completely satisfied, and I did have a PC available to me, so I went with NVivo, which was, and as far as I know, still is a PC-only program. I also want to just mention Qualris, because I emphasize to you the idea of sticking close to your audio when working with analyzing your interviews. Qualris is a program that has been described to me that allows you to directly work from the audio without having to make the transcriptions to begin with. So there is certainly an appeal there, because I don't know anyone who loves transcribing interviews. And the great advantage, which is meaningful to me, is that closeness to the nuances of that recorded audio itself. So that may be something that we'll hear more about as time goes on and as the software goes through improvements and becomes more well known. I should also mention that large and robust programs such as NVivo are adding more and more capability of working with media and working with various file formats. And just a couple of the advantages that I found working with NVivo was that I could take a particular interview transcript and select a color-coded view of all of the codes that are represented in a particular passage. So that was very useful. And then also the ability to generate reports of all of the instances of a particular code or a particular category. That also was quite useful. Before I leave the topic of qualitative research, I want to mention a couple of resources that have been very helpful to me. One is Michael Quinn Patton's book, Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods. I found this to be an excellent reference for most any qualitative research related topic or technique. And Dr. Patton's work is clearly written and easy to follow. An excellent book. Next, I want to mention again Dr. Demaray's book that I showed earlier when I was discussing the article by Patricia Hayes. This is a collection of essays on a wide variety of research methodologies, including some quantitative, but the work is decidedly weighted towards the qualitative side. It includes chapters about case studies, historical research, working with focus groups, ethnography, evaluation, participatory evaluation, survey research, and even conversation analysis, among others. As we come near the close of this presentation, I want to just acknowledge the chapter on historical research in your book. Historical research is not something that we specialize in instructional technology, particularly as a field, or in this program at the University of Georgia. So I won't go into this in much detail. In fact, I only have one slide. But historical research deals with the meaning of events. And the book makes the point that the study of history is one thing that people are generally familiar with, but the historical method is something else. And the heart of the historical method is interpreting the facts that are found in history. And of course, that does take a deeper and a more informed and scholarly look at the historical evidence that is present. I mentioned earlier that content analysis is closely related to historical research, and one can imagine that the example given in the content analysis section of the book, what religious symbols appeared in early Byzantine architecture and with what frequency during the years 527 through 867, that example, of course, is more purely content analysis, but it could be a part of a larger historical research project looking at that period of time. So the book emphasizes that the historical method is not merely to describe what events happened, but to present a factually supported rationale to explain why they happened. And I somewhat take issue with the book on this point, because we've already established that qualitative research does not produce cause and effect outcomes normally. And historical research is essentially qualitative research. So I think that the key to this is to think of the why element in historical research as really looking for the narrative. What is the story? What is the thread behind these historical events? And I would rather couch it in those terms rather than using the word why. And so, in conclusion, here are some summarizing points for you to keep in mind. Qualitative research focuses on phenomena in natural settings and describes the complexity of those phenomena. You, as the researcher, are the primary instrument measuring and working with the data in qualitative research. Purposes of qualitative research are generally description, interpretation, verification, and evaluation. And there are 5 common research designs talked about in the book: case study, ethnography, phenomenological study, grounded theory study, and content analysis. And of course, I have also added conversation analysis as a technique to look at. Observations, interviews, and document analysis are major data collection methods in qualitative research. And finally, the journey from the raw data to the final report involves organization, perusal, classification, and synthesis. And in this presentation, we spent just a bit talking about historical research as well. Historical research finds and tells the story behind the evidence, behind the data that is collected in a project. I hope you've found this presentation helpful, and should there be any gaps that you would like to further explore, there are several avenues you can take. One would be going back to the book chapters. Another would be going to the further reading sections of the book chapters. And then, of course, there are the additional items like the pattern book, for example, that I mentioned in this presentation. And finally, you can always go to your instructor, who I'm sure would be glad to point you in the right direction.